Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I'm Kate Nielsen, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Legal Advocacy for AAUW and the AAUW Action Fund. If we can go to the next slide. I'd just love to commemorate with you all of the great work that AAUW has done. As you know, since our first meeting in 1881, we've really been a catalyst for change. Together, through our coordinated and strategic advocacy, we've enacted invaluable legislation at the federal, state, and local levels. And that work is important, if not, it's just as important, if not even more so now with what we're currently dealing with. And we have this unique opportunity and responsibility to advocate for women and girls in this strange and scary time. One of the most important ways that we can advocate is through our votes. In this important election year, AAUW and the AAUW Action Fund encourage individuals to get involved in the political process by educating yourselves and others about the issues at stake and where the candidates stand on them. And we're here to help you with that. AAUW and the AAUW Action Fund are nonpartisan, but that doesn't mean that we're non-political. And tonight, we're going to talk about how you can get involved and the resources to assist with those efforts. Before we jump in, just a few housekeeping notes. As we go, you can direct any questions about the program and the content to the Q&A box. If you have any technical questions that we can help with, please direct them to our panelists in the chat box. We'll save most of the questions until the end, but I encourage you to write them in as you think of them. If they're particularly topical, I may interrupt our panelists for them to weigh in on the spot. Next slide, please. All right, now I'd like to introduce you to tonight's speakers. Robin Lucas is the Grassroots Advocacy Manager for AAUW and the AAUW Action Fund, and Letty Bustillos is our Federal Policy Manager. Together, they're going to walk you through important components of the upcoming election and how you can get involved. They'll discuss voting access, getting out the vote, and voter education. Then we'll take some questions and conclude with new and forthcoming resources. Once again, please use the chat box for technical questions and the Q&A option for substantive questions. Let's jump in. Robin?
Thank you, Kate. Hello, everyone. I'm Robin. My pronouns are she, her, and welcome to Voter Access and Education during the COVID-19 pandemic. Tonight, let's start by talking about the overarching voter issue, access. Next slide. And this is a rapidly shifting reality and varies state by state. So tonight will be a general review of the history and current state of access throughout the country. We want to operate tonight with two key messages in mind. One being our constitutional rights do not pause during a public crisis. And two, there is no one approach fits all access to voting. So we need to prioritize expanding options for voting and not just shifting the one option folks have to something else. Next slide. Tonight, we're going to talk about how to make progress on these important issues and move us forward. As we go through the webinar, I challenge you to think about what your voting experience has been and why. Voting access is a combination of the laws and rights in your area and your particular ability to practice them. Doing the work to constructively and intentionally understand your experience in the greater context of voting access will help you tailor your get out the vote efforts and the message for your area specifically. Voter suppression has existed since the birth of this nation, and it comes in both new and old forms. The disenfranchisement of voters continues under the guise of restrictions claiming to prevent voter fraud, even though voter fraud is repeatedly studied and proven to be a rare occurrence. Secure and accurate voting is absolutely critical for the legitimacy of our democratic elections, but so is accessibility and fairness. Now, I understand that there are different viewing experiences and abilities tonight between laptops and phones and tablets. So with the small font on this slide, I'll read out both lists here. On the left-hand side, we have voting access, which has vote by mail, early voting, no excuse absentee voting, online voter registration and voting, and maintained in-person voting with public health protections at all polling places. On the right, under voter suppression, we have voter identification requirements, voter registration record purges, lack of access and flexibility on voting, closure of polling places in predominantly Black counties, and finally, and most recently, maintaining voting schedules without ensuring public health protections. So let's talk about the role that you can play as individuals and how we can harness our collective power to protect the right to vote and mobilize people to exercise that right. But first, let's take a step back and review the history and evolution of access with my colleague, Letty. Next slide.
Great, thanks so much, Robin. And as you might guess, this is Kate again, not Letty, with those special words, technical difficulties. So I'm going to start Letty's presentation for her, and hopefully she'll be able to jump back in. But in the meantime, thank you, Robin, for that background. And I think it's really important to be talking about the history of this topic before we jump into what we can do with it now. Our right to vote has a long and tumultuous history. And protecting that right, that one that many have thought long and hard for, continues today as ongoing efforts to suppress a right negates what it means to live in a free democracy. More than a century ago, the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right of all men to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 50 years later, in 1920, the 19th Amendment gave some women the right to vote. It wasn't until 1965, after decades of racially discriminatory practices like literacy tests, poll taxes, and Jim Crow laws, that the right to vote, free of racial discriminatory acts, was written into law with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In signing the law, President Johnson said, "It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country." Despite this landmark legislation, some communities were still unable to equitably access their right to vote. The 1975 amendment to the Voting Rights Act required that all voting materials be made available in multiple languages and ensured the right to vote for Asian Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. Next slide, please. Broadly speaking, the Voting Rights Act made any election law and/or practice that discriminated and prevented anyone from voting against the law. Two critical provisions, sections 4 and 5, gave teeth to that law. Section 4 of the VRA provides what is known as a, quote, coverage formula that identified states with the history of unlawful, racially discriminatory election laws and practices. In 1965, states covered under this formula included Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia, as well as some other counties. Section 5 of the VRA required that states who were identified by Section 4 to seek out, quote, pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before they could enact any changes to their election laws. That is, the states had to prove to justice that any proposed changes would not discriminate on the basis of race, sex, or language. In 2006, the Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, and Coretta Scott King Voting Rights Act of 2006 both reaffirmed the country's commitment to the right to vote, but also ensured its protection by extending these critical provisions for 25 years. However, on June 25, 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby v. Holder that Section 4 was unconstitutional because times had changed and the old formula no longer applies. And in finding Section 4 unconstitutional, it made Section 5 inoperable until Congress develops a new coverage formula. That, as the court stated, quote, speaks to current conditions. The immediate result of this ruling could be seen within 24 hours. Strict voter ID laws in Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, curtailment of early voting, and elimination of same-day registration in North Carolina. All voter suppression tactics that rendered moot the original intent of the Voting Rights Act. This rollback by the Supreme Court and Congress's inability to break the partisan divide make the right to vote especially precarious during this time of COVID-19. Next slide, please. With the pandemic, the space to abuse is widening. Voter suppression tactics, as Robin described, are evident across multiple states, jeopardizing not only our right to vote, but our ability to stay safe while exercising our rights. To protect our rights, the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2019, introduced in both the House and the Senate, aims to provide a new coverage formula as required for Section 4 of the VRA, as well as ensure that no last-minute voting changes will negatively affect voters, as any changes will need to be announced 180 days before an election. And while the CARES Act provides $400 million in election security grants to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus in the 2020 federal election cycle, experts and advocates alike say it is not enough. Estimates suggest that that is not enough. At least $2 billion are needed for states to prepare for accessible and safe elections in November. So where do we go from here? Robin, will you fill in how COVID-19 is further impacting voter access and what to do about it?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate. Next slide. All of this history that Kate reviewed, it really shows why this work is so important. To put it into context, I'm sorry we have to do it, but I will use Wisconsin as an example. Just over 2 weeks ago, Wisconsin held their Democratic primary. They were the only state to hold elections that day, and the country hopefully is learning from all of the mistakes and outright suppressive decisions that surrounded the entire election process there. Wisconsin, the primary was held on April 7th. I have a few points underneath reviewing how it went and how it impacted both in-person and absentee. So the in-person vote was inconsistent with the health protections and messaging. And as of today, there are 19 confirmed COVID-19 cases connected to polling places, either polling place volunteers or voters themselves. Which brings me to the second point. Polling places were severely restricted in number. And finally, with the absentee ballots, there are ballots that were never sent, never received, and are still being discovered unopened. 3 bins were just discovered by a postal worker this week. This then brings us to the Supreme Court decision that also impacted Wisconsin. The absentee ballots must be postmarked. No extensions, Wisconsin, and no exceptions. Ballots have been found to be missing postmarks entirely. So if they must be postmarked, but the post office literally misses the mark, they're declared invalid. Or in rural communities with a postal truck that comes only once a day, a voter handing in her ballot on election day likely won't be postmarked until the next morning, and thus, again, invalidated. I also want to highlight that 17 states and Puerto Rico have delayed their primaries. Most delays have moved to June 2nd. And as this year continues and states explore and enact new legislation impacting voter access, we all need to do our best to pay attention. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the language around solutions to the 2020 election process. Vote by mail is understandably gaining ground as the popular answer to safely voting with a public health crisis. So I want to clarify a few details around this. I have absentee voting, no excuse absentee voting, vote by mail, and the new one, all mail vote. First one, absentee vote. It's a process by which a voter requests a ballot to be sent and traditionally has required an excuse. So there are 17 states that still require justification for absentee voting. No excuse absentee voting is the same, but no justification is necessary. There are 33 states and the District of Columbia that practice no excuse absentee voting. Vote by mail, again, a very popular solution being explored right now in most states, is the automatic process of sending all voters ballots. There are 5 states who have been practicing vote by mail, and note that traditionally polling places are generally still open with vote by mail practices. However, this brings us to the fourth and final term, all mail. Some of those states, specifically Hawaii, Alaska, and Wyoming, have eliminated in-person voting and have shifted to mail-in only. So while vote by mail and this opportunity to safely vote is helpful in ensuring the right to vote in during the pandemic, there are 2 key challenges. Mailing addresses is the first one. It's important to note that in addition to the difference between voters having to request and process their absentee votes, all options require mailing addresses. Native Americans, Americans experiencing homelessness, and many rural communities lack mailing addresses. adequate postal infrastructure, and the resources to remedy the situation. And then the second key challenge is internet access. If you don't have access to the internet, how are you going to request an absentee ballot if the information on how to process it and the forms themselves are all digital? I want to end this with an extra fun point. These definitions are blurred depending on your state. So while I definitively state terminology here for the nationwide definitions, this might not actually be how your state in particular defines it. This is exhausting, confusing, and counterproductive? Maybe. Next slide, please. So this brings you to the first call to action for the night. I know most folks are not fans of phone calls these days, but a new perk that I've learned recently is that if you're on a phone, you don't have to worry about what your face is doing, like I've been anxious about this entire webinar. So for tonight, I do have two asks. The first is simple. If you're not in one of those vote by mail states, figure out how to request an absentee ballot and relevant deadlines and cutoffs in your area. The second is a call to advocate for expanding access options and ask what is being done in response to the pandemic in your area. Here I have 3 tips. First, make your calls to Secretary of State, Board of Elections, or Governor. If calling your elected representative, remember to use the very magical words and plan your script. I've written one out here. I'm calling today to ask how the upcoming election will be conducted. As a constituent, I'm concerned about the upcoming elections being conducted safely and accessibly. What is our state doing about voter access during the public health crisis? You can use a list of options to vote at the beginning of this section to determine just how many you have access to in your state and narrow down where you need to advocate further. And remember that your call really does count. I know it's hard to imagine that calls are still being tallied with offices shut down to essential staff, but they are. And my additional tip here, post about your experience online. Social media is a great follow-up tool for both accountability with elected officials and education opportunity for your communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so in any other election year, this would be when we talk about get out the vote in terms of tabling at local events or grocery stores, knocking down those doors, and seeing musicians and celebrities literally rock the vote. So I want our membership to all take a deep breath with me, nod, and acknowledge that social distancing is now the norm. And let's explore how to still get out that vote. Next slide. So the general get out the vote strategy has always been identify and mobilize. GOTV, or Get Out the Vote, is a series of efforts to register and motivate voters for elections by asking if they're registered, where the polling place is, and how they plan on getting to and from it, and will they commit to voting on that day. As many of us know, targeted and personal connections are more effective to then mobilize and inspire those voters. So in-person efforts have traditionally been prioritized. Next slide, please. That said, it is no longer the before time, and we are trying to get out the vote during COVID-19. Both everything and nothing has changed. The tactics are what we'll have to shift, and we're shifting away from those traditional in-person efforts to a few options that I do have listed here that we can still do. The first being phone calls. Phone or text banking together virtually can still be both impactful and a collaborative effort. Just like we are doing tonight with Zoom, you can host a Zoom in your networks, or everyone agree to still get pizza delivered to their house or make food and create that party atmosphere that we're used to with text and phone banking, but doing it safely in our own homes. The second one is a postcard campaign. Again, a lot of folks are familiar with it, but this is the dropped off materials that you can fill out like a postcard or a letter that you include personal information on, like an inspiring note on why someone should go vote in order to motivate them to register and then vote on the day itself. And this can still be conducted with a no contact drop off. This also has the added benefit of then supporting the USPS. And then the third one social media is my immediate go-to. Let me confirm everyone's sneaking suspicion. We will forever be talking about social media as one of our major methods to get out the vote. I do want to end this slide with, remember that your efforts truly are important now more than ever, and be kind to yourself with it. You can channel your energies in a productive way as long as you remember that this is a marathon year and not a sprint. Next slide, please. So, next action item, voter registration drive. Registering voters, again, is best done through direct, personal, and targeted contact. That said, let's get creative and shift it to online. So an online voter registration drive could look like messaging posted on social media, like I said, hosting live videos on your platforms, or engaging directly with people digitally. I have 4 tips here, though. Be prepared with links to your state's voter registration information and rules. Hosting this online makes that way more accessible, where you can just give them the link instead of printing everything out on materials. Second one, remember to partner with coalition members. Check in on popular hashtags and online campaigns. See if there's an active drive already happening now. At this point, there likely are. 3, like I said, keep your messaging personal and direct. And just like we're doing with our hands these days, wash, rinse, repeat. Get out the vote efforts come in waves with primaries and general elections, so repeating your efforts is productive. And if you have one, remember to include an anecdote of something memorable. For example, next slide. All right, so here's a tweet that I had tweeted out last week. So in 2016, I was caught in a voter registration purge, and that was embarrassing for me to not have noticed it until Election Day itself. Thankfully, I'm in Washington, D.C., and we have same-day registration. So it was more of a tedious instead of prohibitive experience, but I was then late to work and I could have missed out on voting altogether. Now I make sure to have everyone in my networks, even other Get Out the Vote organizers, especially other Get Out the Vote organizers, that we've all checked our status by our areas cut off if we have one. Now, notice in this tweet from last week, I used a trending hashtag. Throwback Thursday is always popular. As well as linking myself to the local board of elections. And I used an adorable photo of very, very young 18-year-old me the day I first registered to vote. It's precious, it is super nerdy, and hopefully it's memorable and it caught some eyes and some folks checked out their registration. Maybe today, this week, you can make a post that also urges support for the USPS as a supportive opportunity as well as an educational moment. USPS is overwhelmed, underfunded, and on the front lines of our democracy right now. Without them, the mail-in vote in this country will not function. Next slide, please. So the idea of getting out the vote while so much is in upheaval is a daunting one, I'll admit. We have a true opportunity right now, though, to build direct conversations in our communities on specific voter issues to then later mobilize for Get Out the Vote efforts. Next slide, please. So our first resource here for voter education is the 2020 Voter Issue Guide. It's here. It is on our new website. Please go to aauwaction.org to find it. It provides background, key buzzwords, and suggested questions for our 6 key issues for 2020. I also recommend taking a look at the footnotes for more information on each of the issues to give your background the credible sources to really boost the point. So first, we have voter access. I think we've gone over this just a little bit this evening already, but I really want to drive home that if voter access is expanded to every accessible, safe, and secure method possible, then we will achieve a democratic election. The voter issue 2 and 3 is pay equity and paid sick and family leave. This is especially important with COVID-19 exacerbating economic inequities. Issue 4, college affordability. I don't know about you, but I'm personally cautiously optimistic at how central this conversation has become within the pandemic response and stimulus debates. but we do need to keep pushing the conversation to ensure that the solutions truly address the root of the problems. Issue 5, campus sexual harassment and violence. We all know that this is a problem and it won't go away, but right now we need to make sure that you're carrying the conversation and that survivors are getting the resources and support that they need. Finally, the 6th and final voter issue is healthcare access and reproductive rights. As healthcare systems are strained by COVID-19, the inequities in access and treatment are widening. We are witnessing the maternal health crisis worsening, and pregnant people are being blocked from accessing abortion care. Both issues impact communities of color, working parents, and low-income families at higher rates, and they need your support. So while this voter issue guide was intended for 2020 overall, we did work to update a few of the items regarding COVID-19, and I urge you to take a look at or check it out. Next slide, please. All right, this brings me to the other 2 resources. The head-to-head voter templates are also now available on our website, AAUWaction.org. There is one that is structured for federal and one for state. And these are the voter guides to assess candidates across key issues. They are available in Word format for you to download and use in any and all of your specific races in your area. They cover issues across economic security, education, and civil rights, and touch on the 2020 voter issue guide topics. Next slide, please. Finally, we have the 3rd and final action for you this evening: host a conversation. Use the issue guide and the head-to-head voter templates as a tool to structure conversation, assess your state's needs, and candidate stances. This can be a panel discussion with experts, teletown halls with candidates, or a conversation within your social network. Remember to invite targeted participants and ask them to invite their friends. Prepare remarks to introduce the topic. Research candidate stances in your area and ask prepared questions, or be prepared with conversation starters. With these formats, remember to think of what platforms would you find useful, what would work best for your audience, and are experts and candidates helpful to hear from, or do you need a more intimate conversation depending on the voter issue you want to talk about? Take the information from our resources, virtually gather voters in your communities, and remind everyone that our economic security, education, and reproductive and general health are essential to this democracy. Our civil rights do not rest during a public health crisis, and neither do we. Next slide, please. All right, so Kate, at this point, we're gonna pause and care to share what's coming in with Q&As?
Absolutely. And I think that Letty has joined us again. If that's the case, I just want to give her a second to say hi and give a wave to everyone so that you all know what she looks like and your federal policy manager. So she will be joining on some of the questions. But Robin, thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who's written in. I do want to start by saying that these slides will be made available. So you don't need to, I should have said that at the beginning, so you don't need to write down everything, but this presentation will be accessible afterwards. The first question that I have coming in is, does AAUW support automated voter registration and lowering the voting age to 16? We absolutely support AVR, or automatic voter registration. We do not have an official stance on lowering the voting age to 16. I will tell you a fun fact that my senior thesis when I was in college was about the importance of getting young people active and engaged in voting when they are still in high school. So it's really very important to make sure that young people are engaged from an early age, but we do not have a formal stance on lowering the voting age. There's several state-specific questions. So I just want to flag that it's been called out that Oregon does vote by mail especially well. So I want to encourage everyone to take a look at what Oregon's doing and has done for a while. So thank you to the questions about that and the encouragement that they are an important model to follow. Robin, I'm wondering if you can just tell us generally some of the resources that you pulled this information from and coalition partners to go to if folks are looking for more information. We've had some questions about which states fall into the different categories.
Absolutely. I have been looking at a lot of Board of Elections websites, and my personal favorite resource is the Brennan Center for Justice. They have a lot of information overall, and some analyses on state specifically, and voter suppression in general is one of their key issues for research. So I highly recommend them for the background research that you're doing. Are there additional partners that you would want to add to that, Kate?
No, I think that's great. Thank you for covering that. I know there was one question specifically about the League of Women Voters. It's a great resource. I definitely encourage at the local level everyone to get involved with that. I think AAUW has a longstanding connection with them, and that's a really great place to look. As Robin said, Brennan Center and National Conference of State Legislators are some of my go-tos, and I would emphasize looking to them for state-specific information. Let's see. Robin, here's a question you won't like. There's so much emphasis on social media. What if we're not on it?
That's a really great question for Kate to be asking me. I am the social media guru on the policy team. I do a lot of grassroots advocacy there, and that truly is one of the main areas that is taking grassroots advocacy forward. I highly recommend joining social media. I'm not here to promote any companies specifically, but I mean, the top few are really useful tools for grassroots advocacy and getting out the vote. But if you don't, I would look to your local communities on how they are interacting with each other. And maybe there are some options that I can't highlight, but I know that social media is really useful both as a disseminator of information, and more often what I like to highlight, it connects people. And in this time of pandemic, global health crisis, maintaining those connections is really critical. So if you have questions about how to get on social media and how to use hashtags and whatnot, I'd be interested in talking.
Thanks, Robin. I want to offer a reminder or a request. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, as I'm trying to look through all these questions and make sure that we manage them all. It's easier if they come in through the Q&A option and save the chat feature for technical questions. I'll try and make sure to address everything, but just a request to make this flow as easily as possible. There's so many great questions. I want to make sure I get to them all.
I do see a helpful one that's actually kind of a follow-up to that question. Do you have any canned scripts for Twitter or Facebook? I am working on a social media toolkit for Get Out the Vote and voter education around our issues. So that will be one of the forthcoming resources. And I know, especially for those both who are new to social media and might not know the ins and outs and tricks, but also folks who live on social media, having those social media toolkit or canned scripts is really useful to just go copy paste and push it out. So I'm working on it for you.
And how about social media platforms, Robin? Which ones do you recommend?
As much as I am sometimes loath to say it, Twitter is very useful. I think Twitter is really great to gauge what conversation is happening right now, what is super topical, and also what you can connect your social justice issue to an ongoing conversation. There was trending hashtags, which is how you click it and immediately see the world of conversation happening around that. There was one a month ago. It was National Puppy Day. I'm a dog mom, so I'm a big fan of that. But National Puppy Day, which is just a cute opportunity for you to share photos of you and your dog, was then turned into a conversation about overcrowded shelters, animal treatment, and care, and pushing and supporting adopting animals that need our care. So taking something that's innocuous as National Pancake Day and turning it into a conversation about food scarcity could be a really useful way to get your issue in the top of a conversation.
Great, thanks, Robin. I just want to flag that we do have some questions that are state specific. And in the interest of being applicable to everyone on the phone or on the webinar rather, just going to encourage some online research for state specific questions or following up with us individually after the fact. You can always contact all three of us at advocacy@aauw.org. That's the best way to get in touch with us. Make sure that we can respond to your question if you're not able to find the answer. Also, another really important question that I want to touch on is, can we advocate for a state other than our own? And I certainly think that this is something that if you know folks in the state and you want to provide assistance to them, you can do that on an individual basis. But it's really important when you're reaching out to elected officials that you only contact your own elected officials. It's going to make a much bigger difference to your advocacy if you can say, I'm a constituent. So that's one piece that I think is really important to hit home. Let's see, what's another question? Robin, what do you think is the number one issue facing us in the November election? Access or suppression?
I mean, two sides of the same coin. What I think is our current key concern that we need to tackle is the attitude around the election and how we are engaging and talking about it with each other. Right now, there are, like everyone is posting in the chat, there are so many things changing so quickly and so confusingly. There is a lot of ambiguity in our messaging and in like the legal messaging around laws changing that is kind of expressing this doubt of legitimacy and doubt of validity of these new or new to certain people access to voting. So the way that we really need to continue to recenter our voices and messaging around voter access and fighting suppression is to say, like, all of these opportunities are valid. They are all equal ways to vote, and they're all valuable ways to vote. And like, while yes, I talk about the scary suppression tactics that are being used or the ways that new opportunities to access can be manipulated, I also want to keep bringing us back to this means that we're expanding the right to vote to as many people as possible. And that is a good thing.
Thanks. I have a couple different questions that sort of touch on the same topic that maybe either Robin or Letty can answer. One is about combating misinformation to voters, and the other is about how to decipher between legitimate information on social media and fake news.
Okay, so at least I could take how to decipher. I am a big fan of cite your sources. Where did you read that? That in turn can combat some misinformation. If you ask someone, where did you read that? I mean, social media is a blessing and a curse when it comes to issues like this. And if someone is definitively stating something, but then doesn't say, I learned this from the Board of Elections, or it's, I learned this from my neighbor, that is a very helpful gauge, but a lot of times it's not as clear cut as that. So I would urge everyone to read, if you see something, verify, research into it more, and reach out to organizations that you do trust to inquire with them. I mean, ask us.
Anything else to add?
I would agree with Robin wholeheartedly that it really is about the trusted source. So I'm on Twitter pretty frequently just to keep up to date about who's saying what are they saying, how they're saying it. And for me, it really is about who is saying it. Is this someone that I trust and has provided reliable information? Who's retweeting it? Where is the original source? Who are they citing? So it really is about, doing some research, not just taking everything at face value, but recognizing, where does this information come from? Who is sharing this information? Is it secondhand, thirdhand information? Because there is so much information out there that, it really is sometimes hard to decipher. So it's all about, who do you trust? And, can you go back to the original source of information?
Absolutely. I would follow up with, both of us are talking about kind of like two experiences that we have. Members of AAUW are both individuals, like you are a voter, but you are also taking that next step into being an advocate and taking responsibility for then forwarding that information. So I would say, in addition to doing the research and looking into where that information is coming from, then share that information when you share it with someone else. They're like, okay, I was reading about voter suppression and vote by mail and voter fraud and this, and I read it at Brennan Center for Justice. They did a study on this. Like, in your own dissemination of information, cite your own sources, because that can help other people cut out that research step. And also elevates you into being a trusted source of information because you do your research.
And I just adding on and building off of some comments that have been coming in the Q&A, and thank you for all of your insightful comments, not just questions, but really good information, is to think about where people get their information, if not online and through news sources, in terms of their communities, who trusted allies and partners are, and try and contact those folks to spread information. So, for example, church groups or other community groups can be a really great way to try and elevate issues in those communities to reach people who might not otherwise be reached. Let's see. And I think it's worth emphasizing, I know we've talked about postcard campaigns. There's been a lot of love for postcard campaigns in the comments. So I just wanted to elevate that as well.
Hey,
fun activity
I have
important right now.
4 more sheets of stamps coming in the mail right now. I know a lot of people, we pushed a lot last week to get folks to go buy stamps. And I'm very excited to get my stamps with Sesame Street on it. So.
Excellent. Let's see. Oh, we've also had some questions about AAUW putting out a statement about our stances on this. I do want to flag that we've signed on to an important coalition letter with hundreds of other organizations that outline which stances, which policies we think are most important right now. I'll make sure that that's available to everyone as a resource to be able to push out to not only have AAUW's stamp of approval on it, but hundreds of other groups as well. And unfortunately, one question that just came in, I think is all too relevant, is it possible that this pandemic will discourage people from voting? And the very disappointing answer to that question is yes, it is, which is all the more reason it's encouraging to have so many people on this webinar tonight and engaged in doing this really important work. It's always important to do get out the vote and voter education work. And in this current environment, that's true more now than ever. Other questions specific to AAUW, and to some of them in the vein of collaboration around nonpartisan and working with candidates for elected office. I encourage everyone to look at our board policies to make sure that you are compliant. Those are available on our website. But yes, AAUW is nonpartisan and we do not endorse any candidates. So make sure that you are compliant with that. Even if you are an AAUW member and you're running for office, we cannot provide any support to your campaign, although we wish you the best of luck. Let's see.
I saw a related question on how to get candidates involved in a forum. And I think that hosting and creating candidate forums is easier now more than ever with the switch to digital. Before getting a number of candidates to commit and then not have other things pop up on their schedule and actually go in person to a forum could be really hard. So this kind of levels the playing field for everyone. And as long as they don't have a forum at that hour, it's a lot easier for them to get involved. With that said, not everyone has experience with speaking virtually. And I mean, this is a learning experience for Kate and Letty and I as well. So it can be really hard. I think just being supportive in involving candidates and saying like, look, I know that this isn't everyone's comfort zone. and make it as engaging as possible, or give them time to prepare with questions might be helpful, to really encourage as many candidates as possible in whatever race you're hosting a forum about.
Have another question about photo ID requirement and the pros and cons. This is something that we're opposed to, because in some ways it's equivalent to a poll tax. Requiring folks to have an ID means that they have to be able to get one in the first place, which costs money, not only in acquiring a physical ID, but also in getting there and keeping it updated and things like that. We know, and Robin, maybe you can say a word more about this, that falls under a category of what we would call voter fraud worries, where folks are very, very worried, or some folks I should say, about voter fraud when it's really not an issue.
Yeah, it absolutely isn't. So the Brennan Center for Justice, again, I feel like I should have a t-shirt on. They have done numerous studies over the past decade or so on voter fraud allegations, and the fact that there are very, very few that are valid. And so whenever I see or hear someone talking about voter fraud in the sense of, no, we shouldn't have that as an option, that is a red flag to me of this is a concern for suppression. And I would also follow up with the photo ID and government ID requirements. Not only is it a poll tax, but that also is prohibitive for folks who do not have an address, they do not have secure housing, or they are Native Americans living on a reservation, and when they go to register to vote or go to vote with their tribal ID, they're being told by polling places that it's not valid. And while that then gets rectified in certain states, it is a recurring issue. So there are situations other than just the poll tax conversation of this reducing access to voting rights.
Great, thanks, Robin. Let's see, where was the other question I wanted to pose? So this is a really good flag that just came in the questions about folks sheltering in place who might be at a different from their normal address. And that's a great flag in addition to those populations that may also not be able to be reached by other methods, as Robin was talking about. So I think that this goes to the fact that we really need voter education. It's absolutely crucial in this election. In the past, we've really focused voter education on the issues and the candidates, but we need to make sure that this year it's also about procedures and access to make sure that folks know how to get their ballots, how to vote. And that's a really important, crucial piece for this election in November, as well as the primary. So thank you for flagging that. Let's see. There's also a question about arranging visits with legislators during this time. Robin, do you want to talk about that and how to go about contacting and seeing your legislators?
Absolutely. Again, all of this can be virtual in theory. I urge everyone to, if you are thinking about contacting a specific legislator, go to their website and find their scheduler's email, contact their office, and see what their schedule is and what their current virtual capabilities are. When you reach out to them, again, remember, if it's your legislator, say, I'm a constituent. And I would add to that you could or should also indicate which platforms you have access to, so that they can match up whatever accessibility with internet and interfacing that you both have. I mean, everyone is on Zoom right now, so I'd say, like, I can do Zoom or a phone call or FaceTime, like whatever opportunities that you have at your disposal. I also, as usual, take a photo of you doing this and post it on social media to let other folks know that you did access your legislator. You had a virtual meeting and this is what you talked about, and here's photo proof of it. Or vice versa. If someone is refusing to meet with their constituents, I'd share that information as well. All of that is valuable for your fellow constituents to know. Also, let me know. I want to know if you do.
Great, thanks, Robin. Some questions about just proving voter fraud, and then some other suggestions about resources that I think I can lump all together. We've mentioned it before, but the Brennan Center is really my go-to and Robin's go-to for information about voting. So that's where I would look for statistics. Someone else also called out Ballotpedia and VoteSmart, and those are great resources to find information about candidates, ballot issues, or particular issues. And then finally, someone mentioned the American Library Association's Evaluating Media Information manual, and that can be a great tool on evaluating fake news or otherwise. Let's see. There's two other questions that I'd like to address together. One is about the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and the other about the chances of voter accessibility being adopted at the national level. And I think that those go hand in hand. And so, Letty, do you want to say anything more about VRAA and how it is frankly interacting with the current moment?
So I think what's really important about the VRAA, and I'm sure Kate went over this, it's about the enforcement mechanism that was invalidated by the Supreme Court. So that's one aspect of the VRAA and why it's so important to really see that legislation get through the Senate and signed into law. But I think what really resonates as far as where we are today with COVID-19 and just the uncertainty around elections, and Wisconsin being a key example, is the fact that the VRAA would require that any election actions that would take place, or any election actions that are going to be changed, would have to be changed within 180 days of the election. So that means no last minute, it's Thursday, you're voting on Tuesday, and you can only do it in person. None of that would happen. The VRAA would prevent that. So that way states and individuals who are going to be participating will have very clear direction about how they're able to vote, whether it's mail-in ballot, absentee ballot, in person, and what steps the states and localities will have to take to ensure, especially right now, the security and safety of all voters.
Thanks. And I think regarding the VRAA, which is a really crucial piece of legislation, as well as stimulus money for elections, ideas and questions about whether voter accessibility is actually going to be adopted at the national level, not just state by state, hinge on those things. So the Voting Rights Advancement Act, it passed in the House, as I mentioned during the Letty's part of the presentation, but it has not yet passed in the Senate. And frankly, if I'm reading tea leaves, I don't know the chances of it advancing this year before the election. That's why your advocacy is needed now more than ever to push it over that final hurdle to make sure it actually gets on the floor and does get a vote. So I think that's our best chance. But it's tenuous. I wish I could paint a rosier picture, but I think with what's going on right now, the action is really going to be at the state level, and where we need to concentrate to make sure that states are acting responsibly in the ways that they need to. All right, we only have a couple minutes left and only a couple questions left. You all have been really excellent tonight, just amazing questions. So happy that everyone is so engaged. Just another plug for a resource, vote411.org is from the League of Women Voters, and a great place to look for information. So thank you for that. And then another important question is, where is the 2020 voter issue guide? It is not on the AAUW website. It is on the AAUW Action Fund website, which is aauwaction.org. So make sure to check it out there. Also a reminder that AAUW is a C3 and the AAUW Action Fund is a C4. And what that means is a difference in tax status. You don't need to know a whole lot more about it than that, but it is an important flag to keep in mind to make sure that we are compliant with our tax regulations in terms of how we lobby, how we work on get out the vote efforts and whatnot. Much of this is covered in the the board policies that I suggested you take a look at before. So just be careful that you're being compliant with all state and federal regulations as you endeavor to advance this work.
And I would add to that, that if you have any question on where that line lies, please reach out to me and I will be able to give you some guidance on it.
And as a reminder, you can reach Robin or any of us at advocacy@aauw.org. With that, I'm going to close out the questions. Thank you so much for such great and informative questions, and turn it over to Robin to close us out.
Wonderful, thank you. So here we do have a slide on some more resources on how to get involved as an activist, as well as voter registration tools and other voter education. The 2-Minute Activist tool is now housed at aauw.org/act. So, with our new wonderful website, I do want to update folks on where to find things. And then, like we just reviewed, the voter registration and education tools are at aauwaction.org. So with that, next slide. All right, so thank you again for all tuning in tonight. I hope that the information you received was both helpful and empowering, especially now as voter access is threatened by COVID-19. We appreciate your engagement and all of your hard work, both in the past and moving forward. So with that, stay tuned. Our next webinar on voting access and education, like 201, will be coming. Given all of the interest in the chat, it will be heavily social media 101 maybe. So please give us feedback and let us know what you think and would be more helpful. And I really look forward to working with you in the future. Have a great night and stay safe.